a lot of the objects, they come in and they've been used. And in fact, we want objects that have use. You know, we don't want the pristine object. We want an object that shows its wear. We don't want a toy in a box. We want the toy that's been played with. We want the, you know, that's been wrecked, and not just one child played with it, every child after that, and it was passed down. And by the time it gets to us, that doll, or, you know, has no eye. You know, we want that doll, not the perfect doll in the box. So we want objects with use in them because they have stories and because they have people, and that they show that how much people have used them. The lives of the people, the folk, are in the objects. It sheds every minute, so, you know, small pieces come off the hen's nest every time it would be moved. So it is quite fragile, except it's quite a sturdy piece as well. The great thing about the straw is that it retains its colour. It's probably the same colour as it was and when it was made. It's really a nice, that nice bright shade of yellow. And a lot of the straw objects, this one has been made with a built-up plaiting technique. What it is a hen's nest. Thomas Mangan was 75 at the time in 1955 when he made this. So you're looking at a type of object that was being used in that area in the 1880s and the 1890s. So why would you have a nest for a hen? The reason is that hens will lay anywhere, you know, and they lay in any corner of the farmyard. They'll find a way. And it's much better if you have one hen or two hens. It's much better to keep your hen safe in the kitchen, safe from foxes outside and different things. So you keep this in the kitchen. It becomes part of a piece of furniture. A lot of the other nests we have about 43 nests in the museum, so very popular, especially around Connacht and all the neighbouring counties. A lot of them will have a string, a piece of rope coming out. So the finishing part will have a rope, and it would have been suspended. It's suspended above the ground. So you're keeping your hen safe and you're keeping your eggs safe from mice and different vermin, anything. So the idea, once the hen is happy and comfortable and warm, she'll produce better. She'll produce more eggs, and she, you know, a happy hen is a more productive hen, and it'll prolong the laying season as well and their production season. What we have is a bawnine, drawer bawn, and pampooties. The first thing is the jacket. It's a bawnine jacket. It's more associated. It survives longest in Connemara, but it would have been worn more widespread across the country. It's made from mill-woven white flannel, and it was made in the 1960s by a tailor in Peak, Clare Galway, County Galway, and the tailor was Thomas Duffy, and the folklore collector was Kieran Barrage. But he realised that he thought the museum should acquire some of the objects that were traditionally still being worn by men in the area. So in the 1960s, both the bawnine and the drawer bawn were being worn by older men in Clare Galway. And they're on display. Dorothy has chosen to display them with a pair of pampooties. And this type of moccasin or rawhide shoe, and the way it's made, is one of the styles of shoes that goes back to the early Christian period. And it's not an insular expedient on the Aran Islands. It's actually would have been much more widespread. They're rawhide, and as you can see, you can see that the hair is still on the objects because there's a great grip with the fur or the hair of the animal, the cow, been left on there's a great grip on slippy rocks then, do you know what I mean? So pampooties were worn up until the 1970s. A lot of our objects come from sheds, you know, because most of the time with folk art objects, it's all about embracing the new and discarding the old, and it's usually the older things that the objects that have been dumped out that were part of a more traditional way of life, but also part of a life where there's more scarcity and poverty. Dorothy would like, these are some Halloween masks in the collection, and Dorothy would like to display them in their boxes. So this is a lovely one. I'll stand out of the light. The idea of masking then is the idea of putting on a disguise and, you know, disguising your identity, going from house to house, guising. Very popular at Halloween time, but masks were used at all different times of the calendar years, and often they were interchangeable. It's really about like freedom and liberation to be somebody else, you know, for a night. Or so the Wren boys, the mummers, the, you know, the biddy boys at the Alpana, straw boys, different, everyone's in disguise. So the idea Halloween isn't the only time you're going to be wearing a mask. So these are great, and they've been made of fabric. We have a very interesting mask as well, and it's this one here. Now this is a rare object, and thank you very much. Um, it, it's a Halloween, it's a mask, but it's been made of skin, and it's animal skin, probably a rabbit, and it is, as you can see, there's some whiskers and stuff you can just see left on down here. It harks back to a much older time. In fact, the Folklore Commission would have sent out questionnaires associated with Halloween, and they would have sent out questionnaires associated with Wren boys. But the Wren boys one in 1947 would have asked the question, were skin masks or heads of animals or animal heads worn as part of the Wren boy tradition. And actually, one of the respondents from Erison Mayo said, no, not at the present time, but that used to be the case in the past. But we're moving, they kind of, I think he sort of said that they were moving forward now. We're all into the kind of like we don't use them anymore, you know. So it harks back to an older time. This one is from County Mayo, and it really is an interesting object because we only have one. And even if you look at cultures all over the world, skin masks aren't as common as you might think, but I do think it's going back to a much scarier disguise. That people bring back the change, and then it kind of spur people to move on. They want the running water, they want the electrification, you know, they want, like, people turn on the light, or switch on light was so important for so many people. They realized, you know, how dirty the place is, you know, so then they clean it up, you know. The 50s to the 70s, there's a huge influx of objects because people are dumping them out. And that's the reason why we would get a lot of objects that are not in great condition because they've lain derelict in someone's shed or something. This idea that when people started looking at folklore and folk life, they realised that communities, especially rural communities, there was an insularity about them, and almost that away from the urbanisation, that actually could bring you back to more much earlier beliefs, and they were much more in touch with before organised religion. And it's that idea that you're much more in tune with the land, you're much more in tune with the seasons, you're much more grounded in one way, and that's that people look to folklore to see if they learn about the past. And that is the great thing about folk life objects. They really can give an indication, because some of our objects haven't changed since they're archaeological objects. You know, the archaeological one is exactly the same, and around the 1900s, the same object or the same style of fishing line or whatever, or fishing weight is being used. And it's folk life objects really don't change. But I suppose that when they studied folklore, it can give us an idea give us much more understanding of archaeological objects. In fact, when I studied folklore, I think Dahir Hogan said that, you know, archaeology just brings you back to the person who was once alive, or the person we don't know, whereas folk life brings you to the innermost mind of man, and the idea that, you know, all our objects, there's a part of the person in there. You know, there's no point, we're not going to go to an antique shop and just buy a lovely object. We don't want a lovely object. In fact, we want the object that's been used. We know who made it, who used it, and that there's people involved in it. And the word folk, as part of folk life, it's the lives of people, the folk, through the objects. And that's the most important thing about our collection, is the people in them. And I think Theo Dorgan had done a voiceover for a museum video we do, and he harked back to this idea of an ancient Arabic word, baraka, and it's the grace of the person who used it instilled and embodied in the object. And it's a lovely idea. And the idea that these objects, they live on and they're in our collections, but actually the people live there with them. And I think that's the great thing. You're not just picking up a beautiful object and saying, oh, isn't this so wonderful and it's exotic or wonderful. There's persons and there's people behind them. And I think our archive and the film footage and the different things the museum has done, that we don't just take anything. It's all about people. We're not going to take anything if it doesn't have a providence, a sense of place in the landscape and a person involved, you know.
I suppose what she's done with the exhibition is that she's created an assemblage of objects, which means something to her. And she has grouped works around themes which you can see in her own work, consciously and perhaps subconsciously. For me, the works here really reflect Dorothy's own personal kind of cosmology and the interiority of her own working practice and the way, you know, what she's drawn to. And it's a wonderful avenue to go down to be able to address all of these works across such a range of periods, you know, from Bronze Age through to present day, crossing classical Greece, the Renaissance, medieval times, Renaissance work, you know, the age of Romanticism, the age of Enlightenment, the 19th century, the 20th century. And in engaging all of these works through her eyes, that there's a kind of an equivalence of parallel forms across time and across cultures, which kind of brings them all into a unity for consideration and somehow creates a sort of sense of expanded present. And I think that's really one of the great successes, or will be, of this exhibition. I feel that the period work that might not have come to light at all, might not have been seen other than by conservators in a museum store, is suddenly coming to the light and is being put in a context which gives it contemporary relevance. And many of the works which are here, in fact most of the works in the show, are actually drawn from museum stores, Dorothy's own fascinations and preoccupations. And so there was ground to be made up, I suppose, in terms of inviting conservators, registrars, directors to deal with these requests for work which, you know, by most museum standards possibly wouldn't quite be exhibition ready, let's say, because they've not been requested before or they haven't been brought out to light for consideration for a display. And that often is down to resources, because a museum hasn't got the resources to be able to conserve everything it has. But the eye of the artist is always drawn to something sort of left of field, and that's what makes it so interesting. So it's been great that all of the nationals who are involved in the loans for this show have been so forthcoming and willing to lend work and to help overcome the issues around conservation or in terms of how the work might be displayed or considered. You know, that they've really worked with the artist and with IMMA as well then in helping to realise the exhibition here. I'm intrigued, I suppose, by a number of different works that have come in. There's a beautiful marble sculpture from the 18th century of a nymph, a sleeping nymph, after Canova, the Italian sculpture. And it has been transported naturally. It has been strapped and has polyurethane foam protection, just lying across in strips across the back of the nymph, which are then strapped further, you know, to hold everything in place. Dorothy is very keen that the work might be exhibited in that way. And similarly, there's a wooden sculpture of St. John the Evangelist, and it is beautiful, about 1.5 meters high, you know, very fragile, from the 1530s. It had quite a lot of woodworm, which has been dealt with. And it's at the moment standing in its travelling frame, which is kind of like a prosthetic almost, like an armature for the piece. And again, that's how Dorothy would like it to be viewed. Now, that's not something that a conventional museum hang would normally consider. It just wouldn't occur. And yet it returns your eye as a viewer, as a curator as well now, looking at them and the consideration that this may happen and be shown like this. It really returns your attention much more directly to the piece, which I find absolutely fascinating. If either of those works weren't still, we'd say, strapped in the way they are, or contained in the way they are, I don't think I would be looking at them so intently. There's something about the way in which the pieces are dissected almost visually by the frameworks within which they're contained that causes your eye to really register material, the full, complete form, which it has to read by mentally removing the strapping or the framework. And you have an understanding of the three-dimensionality, of the texture, of the way the light is playing on the piece. All of these things are just so much more heightened. By disrupting the conventions, she's actually returning the attention of the visitor to the piece much more intensely. And I just think that's tremendous. I really find that exhilarating. And then she selected also, which may be in the same room, a photograph by Martin Parr called The Missing Painting. Well, it was a painting that was stolen from Lissadell House. And what's left behind on the wall is this, the shadow of where the painting occurred, which has this kind of very spectral quality, which is quite uncanny. And the room is empty. I mean, there's no person or people in the room, just the furniture, and then this spectral presence of this disappeared painting. And so again, it's somehow about absence and presence that is kind of coming through in many of the individual works, and perhaps because of the groupings and the juxtapositions of works as well, which is really very stimulating to think about. I think it will, yeah, I think it should. But I think they have to be patient, and I think they have to be more bodily aware in the exhibition spaces themselves, in terms of, how they feel when they look at different things, and give it time. Really look at the objects, and how rewarding that will be, how fulfilling to really use their faculties in that way. And challenging, without a doubt. For some people, maybe within the museum world, there might be a sense, having gone to all this trouble of bringing all these objects together, why isn't there more information and text sort of explaining why, and being able to kind of draw the connections maybe across history, that links these things more. But these are connections that should be made optically or visually, first and foremost, and experientially, in terms of perhaps the memories they may invoke at us, or evoke from us. Even the most ordinary of things can create a whole series of memories, which it sounds subjective, but what's wrong with that? That's a good thing. And it brings history to life. It brings historical objects into the present day to be considered within our time, within our environment, within our day, within our means, if we allow it. And it's a golden opportunity to really understand better our cultural heritage and the richness of it. It does invite the audience to just come in and just be themselves. And if there's an element of a challenge in that, there may be, but there's a great release in it as well. To be able to be released to look at things, to compare, to compare and contrast, to really be more attuned to their own personal responses to things, to trust those as well. That's the great contribution that a contemporary artist can actually bring to an event like this, and an opportunity like this, to bring us on a journey, create a story that draws on many stories, and that does it in a way that engages us and introduces us more meaningfully to those aspects of cultural memory that are in our collection and that can be brought to the fore, brought into the light, and that tell us so much more about ourselves and who we are and our history. It says so much for the positivity of working with artists and why we continue today as a museum of modern contemporary art to collect art, to have artists in residence, to ask artists to present educational programs, to exhibit their work. It's a living relationship, a living collection, and we are best placed to refer to memory because memory is always reflected by the present and influenced by our perception of the present. And for that reason, memory is always changing because we're looking at it through a present which is always changing. So when you bring an artist into that mix, it enriches it so deeply and broadly. I think it is a unique exhibition that we have here, and that I hope it's the first of many. Opportunities like this are there, the works are in our collections. It's a new way of presenting of such works, of us all institutionally all working well together. It can only be a really positive thing.
This museum is, for many people, a museum of a museum. The local Dubliners call it the Dead Zoo because it's full of animals that don't move. Of the 300,000 people who come here every year, most of them simply come for a bit of entertainment with some science added. And very much what they're looking at is a 100-year-old exhibition. We have 10,000 animals on display. It's part of a very large scientific collection. But what the public see is just that display portion. And they see it in this Victorian setting. The exhibitions here haven't really changed since about 1910, so about a century with hardly any change whatsoever. So the animals are laid out very much as people wanted to lay them out at the time, and the museum's laid out in a scientific way. And my job as the keeper in managing the department that looks after these collections for the National Museum is to try to bring added layers to that, because we're not radically changing the exhibition. We treat this very much as a stately home would be treated. It's a historic building with a historic interior, and it makes sense as a whole piece, what you might call a cabinet museum, which is part of a style of exhibition that is around 100 years old. And the whole point of that is in nature to show you one of everything. So we have a crocodile, we have an alligator, but we don't have 10 crocodiles or 5 alligators. We have one of each thing. So in this place we can find a lot of animals, that some of which were given to the Royal Dublin Society who started this museum, and others of which were bought specifically to fill gaps in what the donors had managed to give to the organisation over the years. So the work for me is to stretch the knowledge about these collections. Many people see wildlife programs today and they understand the story behind some of these animals. We try to give them stories about the other animals that are less familiar, but we also try to give them a picture about the individual specimens that we have on display, because many of them have interesting historic stories, interesting historic people, whether they were famous or not, that are connected with them, or they've got a very interesting aspect to their scientific side that many people mightn't be that familiar with. Included in the show in IMMA from these collections are a number of objects from exhibition and also some from behind the scenes. The elephant bird egg would be a classic for us. It's tucked away in a corner of our own museum. It's just one of the eggs on display. It's beside an elephant bird skeleton from Madagascar. But taken out on its own and put on a pedestal, it is a fascinating object in its own right. This individual egg travelled across Madagascar. We have the notes about that when it was acquired. It ended up in the port on the civilized side, where it was brought back to England and then sold at auction to somebody who really treasured it. He knew that elephant birds were extinct. He knew there weren't going to be a whole supply of elephant bird eggs. It's possibly the rock of the ancient Marco Polo stories, but once you get back into fable, these things are just, for a scientist, something that you may never get to the bottom of. But it does give these things sometimes a big added cultural value, and here in the scientific setting of this museum, you simply see the scientific information, which even here is quite limited. When it comes to putting these objects on display somewhere else, that's really the artist's choice and the curators who help the artist to achieve their ambition. And our job is really to facilitate artists. We facilitate scientists every day, but we also get about 50% of our inquiries come from other backgrounds. And many of the people we do a lot of engagement with would be artists as much as any of the scientists who come here for scientific reasons. And in this particular show, it's really down to the curator to pull together, here are interesting objects, or here's the story about the thing that's attracted the artist's attention. And in this specific exhibition, we're talking about things that are found. The artist is always interested in beach combing and in things to do with nature, and we've engaged with Dorothy Cross before on other projects. And in this particular instance, it's a case of walking around and having a chat about interesting objects in the collections. So in some ways it's rather different to some of our other users. If people come to the National Museum looking to borrow objects, it's usually to tell a very specific story and explain a period of history to the public or something of that nature. And they will come with a particular hit list of things that are needed to do that. Whereas the artist that's coming to us in this case is looking for connections between objects that might come from different institutions, different major museums. So you will find a crab that is particularly interesting because it looks like something that's in a piece of sculpture elsewhere in another collection. And those are ways of looking at things that aren't familiar to me as a scientist, but they're very much the way that the artist might see the world. And while my job as a curator on a day-to-day basis is to explain the scientific parts of our museum to people, there's lots of other ways of looking at the world, and that's one of the key things that makes sense in this exhibition gallery. This museum is laid out on scientific principles, and the overarching structure that we use is the Linnaean system, which is the scientific naming of things based on how closely related they are to each other. So you would group humans in with the great apes, and you would group the great apes and the lemurs in with the primates, and the other monkeys would all be in that bigger cluster. And that is basically the principle on which this museum is laid out. So you go and you find the reptiles, they're all together. And you find the lizards, and then you find the crocodiles, and then you find the snakes in separate sections of the museum. And that's the scientist's way of laying things out. And when this museum was laid out 100 years ago, it was laid out on what we would call a taxonomic basis, basically following the chapters of the textbook. And of course, because humans write the textbooks and decide the structures that are there in nature, but it's up to us to interpret, we always end with the primates, which is ourselves. And the last thing you see leaving today from the museum is the human skeleton, because of course that's at the top of the tree in terms of our way of structuring things. Now there is an underlying nature to that. There's the steps of evolution that take you from the most simple organisms up to more complicated as time went on over millions and billions of years. But there are still ways of giving things status and hierarchy even within a museum like that. Certain objects here are treasures from the public point of view and are used by the museum as flagship exhibits to come and see, whether that is the dodo skeleton, simply because there are only about 20 of those in the world, or the solitaire skeleton, which appears in this show, which is even rarer. But the solitaire did not appear in Alice in Wonderland, didn't get sketches, didn't become a caricature of itself, didn't appear in Ice Age, the movies of recent animation, and so on. So some of these things, although they're extremely important scientifically and they're big favourites of mine, wouldn't have that same status. And this is one of the things that the artist has chosen to do, is to look at the status of things because of the stories they can tell, or because the relationships they make sense with other objects, and even questioning the value that people put on things. Why do people tend to put great value on oil paintings of great scenes by great artists, and objects that come from nature that might be just as rare as a one-off painting are considered the sort of thing that you can buy on eBay for $50? One of the other aspects of this museum is the very large collections behind the scenes, and it's another thing that the artist is engaged in. We walked through all of the stores and talked about a lot of different things that were on the shelves or in the cupboards or sitting on pallets and in crates. And the collections are around about 2 million objects, as far as we can guess, in terms of the scientific collections that we look after. We could simply count them, but we get nothing else done, but that's our estimate. we know there's only 10,000 things on display, and yes, we could have a much richer museum that was twice this size and populated with a lot more interesting stuff. But a huge proportion of the collection is also scientifically structured, so that for the 3,000 birds on display, for example, there are 17,000 birds in storage in our scientific collections, but they're not assembled and mounted up with wires and posed with glass eyes to look like they might look in flight. They're simply study skins. So when somebody wants to come and study the barn owl, we can show them 50 specimens of Irish barn owls that they can go through, and they can study the patterns in plumage. They can see some slight differences between the west coast and east coast of Ireland. And the person who was studying barn owls was looking at barn owls right across Europe and into Asia. And that's something else that museums do behind the scenes. It's not very much what the public sees a museum doing, but it's a very important part of what we do as scientists behind the scenes, serving a scientific public and international research. So there's a lot more happening here than just public display. And sometimes that's quite interesting to get those contrasts across, that all of the objects that you'll see in this exhibition in IMMA were not prime exhibition objects. Some of them were, but some of them are things that have lived behind the scenes for years and would be low on the priority listing based on our choices as curators in terms of what we put in our exhibition.
I'm Anne Hodge, Curator of Prints and Drawings at the National Gallery of Ireland, and the gallery has been around since 1864. Its doors opened to the public, so it's been very much part of the fabric of Irish life and society since that time. And our role here in the gallery is to collect, preserve and present art, mainly European art, and in particular Irish art, to the Irish public and to visitors, of course, as well. My role was to sort of liaise with IMMA and Dorothy Cross, and to facilitate Dorothy when she was looking into the collections here in the National Gallery, to in particular show her the material in the Prints and Drawings collection. So I would have spent quite a number of hours with Dorothy looking and being excited by what was interesting to her, and looking at our collections in a little bit of a different way. So I suppose very much facilitating, being there to help when necessary. It's exciting. It's, I suppose, slightly worrying at times. You want the collection that you're responsible for to look its best and to come across well. But what interested me most was seeing the type of things that sparked off something in Dorothy Cross's mind. For instance, material that has been here for many years and maybe hasn't ever been exhibited. Things like Frederick William Burton's studies. Burton, although he became director of the National Gallery in London in later life, he was very much a practicing artist, created large-scale oil paintings, but of course, like any good artist, did a lot of preliminary work, and these studies found their way into our collection. They give you a real sense of what he was doing, what interested him as an artist, and also that whole academic side of art and art practice in the 19th century. So they've been hidden away. There's a beautiful image of a foot that Dorothy, lit on and was really excited by. There's a shoulder as well. There's just lots of items that they haven't really got much attention before, and here is this contemporary artist, and you're trying to see it through her eyes, and of course that's what Trove is. It's all of these amazing national collections seen through one person's eyes. I think she's interested in the practice of artists in the past. For instance, we have a very beautiful drawing of a hare after Albrecht Dürer's very famous drawing, which is in the Albertina in Vienna. And this drawing we have is an early copy after Dürer. It's, we think, by an artist called Hoffmann. Here is Hoffmann looking at this great work. The hair looks almost alive, it's so real. Centuries later, Dorothy Cross is looking at this hair, probably because it is so beautiful, it is so lifelike, and yet it's a copy, it's an artist learning from another artist. And here she is being inspired centuries later by these artists also. It's kind of it's an ongoing process. It's so cyclical. We're always looking back in order to move forward, and I think Dorothy Cross in her own work really embodies that. These very disparate items she's selected from the collection just very clearly give that sense of that all artists are part of this continuum, if you like, and nature, of course, being very key in her own practice and work. She's picked that up in a lot of the items she's been excited by. I think it's an exhibition you really need to spend time looking at, thinking about, just as a viewer, and wondering why, how, why things are put together. It'll be very exciting. That's, I suppose, one of the things that's quite different for me as a curator. Part of my job is interpretation, labels, text panels, trying to make the artwork, in my case, more accessible to the viewer, open it out to them. But in this case, the items are put there, and it's up to the viewer to make what they will of it. I think it is interesting to think about Dorothy Cross's own work, and I think that would help people kind of make sense of this very disparate group of objects and artworks. One of the things that I love what she's done is she was very excited by our miniatures collection. We have a very rich collection of works from the 18th and 19th centuries, and she chose quite a number of works. They're very tiny, they're maybe 5 centimetres, and she then, in her head, it seems that she's pairing them in some sense with the shark's teeth. When you look at these things together, which at a glance they're so different, and yet close up the colours can be very close. The preciousness of them, some of them look like little hearts. The miniatures, these small portraits, they were often done as a token of love, and often would have been kept close to the heart. So I think juxtaposing the two makes sense in some way. She particularly looked at our miniature by John Comfort of Robert Emmet, and of course the great nationalist and patriot who was executed for high treason in 1803. So she's chosen this image, which Comerford, he actually did the sketch for the portrait in the courtroom when the sentence was being handed down to Emmet. So I think as an artist, Comerford was conscious that this was a really historical event. Something serious was happening here in terms of the development of Ireland and Irish nationalism. And then he created this very beautiful, very delicate portrait of Emmet in profile. I suppose he probably had an eye to, his public, his patrons. He was only just making a name for himself, and so creating a portrait of this significant figure, would help him to become better known in Dublin. We believe that he made the original sketch on which the miniature portrait is based from a drawing he did in the courtroom. And of course Emmet is this iconic figure, and images of Emmet, Robert Emmet particularly, there's a print of him standing in the courtroom. He has these fashionable tights, white tights that the men in the early 19th century wore. He's standing in the courtroom looking very serious, orating, and that print was in many cottages and houses around the country right through the 19th century. In fact, Jack Yeats, there's a little watercolour by Yeats, it shows that print in the background hanging over the mantelpiece. It's amazing. So Emmet, I think, is an incredibly iconic figure for Dorothy Cross to choose, and I'm sure she did that knowingly. Yeah, so as a curator here in the gallery, when I put artworks on display on exhibition here, or when we are lending works to another collection, we want to present them in the best light possible. And of course we have really magnificent works, old master drawings, very beautiful watercolours by Irish artists from the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. We always strive to present them in a beautiful manner. With the exhibition Trove, Dorothy wanted, in some cases, to show works as they were in storage, without much intervention from a conservator or a curator, uninterpreted, if you like, unconserved. And we went along with that so long as there was no danger to the work, because obviously one of our main responsibilities is the preservation of the artworks in the collection for future generations. But it certainly is very different from how we would generally present material from our collection. I think she likes to see the accretions of age. She likes to see the history of the piece. In a way, it's kind of naked in some senses, you know, it's just as it is. Here I am, I'm an artwork that was created in 1850. Nobody's, you know, too worried about me. I'm not a great piece of art, and here I am. But obviously that piece of art can say things to us now if we look at it closely. And I think the viewers of this exhibition will, because of the juxtapositions with other items and things that just you would never put together unless you were Dorothy Cross. Yeah, I suppose the fact that these works, many of which I'm really familiar with from our own collection here in the National Gallery of Ireland, they're being taken out of their usual context and they're being put into a very different environment with very different items, sometimes other artworks, sometimes items from the natural world like the shark's teeth, or you know, items that are really very much part of our history as an Irish people. Ordinary things like pamputis, or they were ordinary in the 19th century, of course now they're museum objects, and she's making us think, I suppose, in a wider sense about Ireland as a whole, not cut down into like nice little neat things, and this is Irish country life, and this is natural history, and this is fine art, drama. It's bringing them together and allowing, I suppose, a dialogue in some senses to take place between the actual artworks, and then broadening it out, it allows us as viewers, as interested people, to have a dialogue among ourselves. And for me as a curator in the gallery, it was exciting to work with colleagues across the other institutions to see what they were doing, to look closely at the items they're responsible for, and to see, you know, how maybe could we pull together a little bit more, how can we coordinate efforts, because obviously things are very difficult for all of us working in these kind of museums and cultural institutions at this time. So I suppose it's opened my eyes as a curator in terms of what might be possible in the future. I think for me, what this show is doing is allowing us all to see, and I include both those of us who work in the museums and also just all of us as people living in Ireland today, that we've had a long history of wishing to understand and preserve our cultural heritage. It's all there. I mean, generations of scholars, curators, collectors, and more recently conservators have been working either individually or together to, to gather it all up, to store it safely, and to allow us to dig into it. It's to allow future generations to understand our past. And by bringing these very diverse collections together, you realise it's not, we're all working to the same end really in these institutions. And it is for the greater good. It is for the enjoyment, the education of the public, of anyone who wants to come along and look and see. So like we're preserving and interpreting in many cases the tangible remains or the material remains of our past for future generations.
Yeah. Maria Canavan. I'm a paintings conservator at the National Gallery of Ireland. I work in a team in the conservation department of mixed painting and paper conservators, and we look after the collection of the gallery as it's travelling and in the gallery. The gallery is the home of the National Art Collection, and we have the collection on display in our Marion Square Gallery, which is in the city centre, but we also send artworks for loan to various institutions around the world, and for this particular exhibition we've sent a number of paintings and sculptures, prints and drawings to be displayed alongside the other artwork in the exhibition. So we have a variety of items from the gallery collection on display in the Trove exhibition. There's a number of marble busts, we have some prints and drawings, miniatures, sketchbooks, paintings, and larger sculptures such as this one here. This particular sculpture is a carved wooden sculpture with polychrome coating, and as you can see by looking at it, a lot of the coating is missing, so there's only about 20% of the coating remaining. You can see it here in the creases and in the crevices of the sculpture. It would originally have been coated entirely with a gesso plaster and then painted on top with a gilding layer, but unfortunately over the centuries that's been lost, and you can only really see the remnants of it in some areas. The piece is made up of an original carving, which is really goes from the head here down to about halfway down the calf of the sculpture, and the rest has been replaced at some point later, and you can tell because it's got a different texture and a different surface to the original. So the feet here and the base are a later addition, as well as the left arm, which is later as well. So it's a mixture of original and later additions. We don't have any documents about when that might have happened, but it probably is a second edition. Probably what would have happened was these parts were lost at some point in transit. There was obviously a problem in the past with woodworm infestation, and you can see the holes from the woodworm throughout the original parts of the wood, where we don't really have holes on the newer parts, so we can tell that the infestation was there before the addition of the newer parts, and since then there hasn't been any further infestation. But probably what would have happened was it was fragmented and many parts were lost, and it was put back together when it was brought into the collection for display. And the whole thing then has been coated in a toned layer of a kind of an ochre toning throughout, so I suppose that's to try to bring together the new and the old parts. But unfortunately there's only a very small area in most parts where you can see the original colour. It would have been a much more colourful piece, and it would have been gilded decoration on the robes, and it would have been a fantastically colourful item, but at the moment it's kind of a shadow of its former self. This particular sculpture is comprised of newer and older additions that are joined together, and in some cases the joints between them are quite weak, so we wanted to make sure in the packing that each part was equally held with equal pressure, so that there wasn't a chance of anything breaking. So the way it's been designed, there's points of contact here with foam up against the side of the object, contacting it on the same kind of plane of both parts, the original and the later parts, just holding them in place so that if there's any bumps along the way or any movement at all, that they're equally pressurized and there's not going to be a significant load on one side and not on the other. So the whole base has been held here by 3 points, and then on the way of the middle of the body near the joints between the old and the new is also held, and then at the top again we've held it. So it's sort of to try to spread the pressure throughout rather than like having it sitting on one particular spot as it's moving. The construction that's been made then is made in such a way that it will come apart in a particular order, so that it can be taken apart from the top down, one batten at a time, and that just makes it easier to unwrap it, easier to take it in and move it in and out without having to actually move the sculpture at all. So this whole thing can be dismantled without affecting the sculpture in any way, and then the sculpture we can take it from the plinth that it's on just by moving it rather than tipping it or lifting it. So the whole thing has been designed in order to be able to move the sculpture with the least amount of intervention on the actual sculpture, so that we can kind of make it easier to move, so that nobody has to strain or lift or tilt or do anything that increases the risk of damage occurring to the sculpture. Polychrome is just a term that's used to describe sculpture that's carved out of wood, and then it would be coated with a gesso, which is a kind of a plaster made out of chalk and animal glue, and then the colour would be applied on top of that, similar to what you'd see in a tempera panel painting or in a fresco. And then on top of that there would be gilding and sometimes different sorts of punching or different sorts of detailing on the gesso. And it's something you'd see a lot in Northern Europe. In a lot of churches they would have these sort of religious polychrome sculptures, and it's not something that's really seen a lot in Ireland at all, and even in the National Gallery collection it's not something we have a lot of. But this particular piece has a companion piece that's also part of the gallery collection. So it probably arrived in the collection, they arrived in the collection together, but they may have come from a larger collection of similar pieces. With the gallery collection, it's a mishmash of items that were donated by patrons, inherited by the gallery, or bequested, gifted to the gallery, combined with items that were bought by the gallery for the collection. So it's sort of, a lot of the gallery collection may have connections within itself. So things that come in a bequest, we might receive 20 or 30 items that are interrelated. So we'll find with some of the paintings, they may have similar style frames. So then you know that they're from a similar collection. And then sometimes we might receive a bequest with a painting that is of particular interest, but it may come along with other items that are not quite as significant, that would remain in the stores maybe, or they might, the significance of those items might be tied to the fact that it comes from that collection. The role of conservation really is, would be to, regardless of the significance of the piece, would be to try to preserve and try to prevent deterioration and damage going forward, because what we might see as significant today, in 50 years time or 100 years time, it may be more significant to people then, or less. So we don't know. So we try to deal with each work in the collection with the same level of care, regardless of whether it's, you know, the Rembrandt or if it's an unknown artist in the stores, so that going forward, who knows, maybe that painting by an unknown artist might receive a new attribution and might be seen as more significant. So we want to make sure that everything is dealt with in a sort of an even-handed way.
My name is Nessa O'Connor. I'm an archaeological curator in the National Museum of Ireland, and I work for one of the 4 divisions that contributes to the Trove exhibition at IMMA. We have a number of different types of objects on loan to the exhibition. Perhaps most significantly, this collection of Olm stones, dating for the most part between the 4th and the 8th centuries AD. They are quite a fascinating collection, really, in that they are of interest from a variety of different perspectives. Archaeologically, historically, from a linguistic point of view, and also perhaps because of the interesting collections history that lies behind them. There are 10 stones here in the exhibition. The vast majority of them are from County Kerry. They do occur in other parts of the country as well. And I think that it is a really good opportunity for visitors to the Museum of Modern Art to see a collection of Olm stones together that would normally be sited in individual townlands and parishes, mostly in the southwest of Ireland. It is interesting as well that they date to around the transition period between Celtic and early Christian times in Ireland. As you can see here, there are inscriptions that lie along the sides of the stone. Generally speaking, they're read from the base of the stone, up one side, across the top, and down to the base. The majority of inscriptions contain genealogical information, like X, the son of Y, or the grandson of Z. The Ogham stones have been studied by many scholars down through the years. They first came to attention as far back as the early 18th century. And the stones that we see here in the exhibition today show several different stages of studying and of being catalogued. Most prominent here, you will see a red number, which derives from the time when William Wilde, who was the father of Oscar Wilde, catalogued the antiquities in the Royal Irish Academy's collections in the 1850s. So this number derives from that period. And you'll see quite obviously as well that we have present day labels on the stones. And it is part of our work in the National Museum to catalogue and record every possible detail of the archaeological objects that come into our collections. In the 19th century and earlier, records weren't always kept as precisely as they are now, but we're fortunate that in the 1940s, for example, Professor McAllister, who was Professor of Archaeology in University College Dublin, published a major work on the Ogham stones, and he actually travelled around the country and recorded the Ogham stones, majority of which, by the way, are still in situ in different parts of the country. So the ones that we see here were taken into the collections of the Royal Irish Academy or the National Museum, usually because they were at risk for some reason or because they were found actually concealed in the ground and needed to be safeguarded in a museum. The context of the Ogham stones is extremely interesting, and you have a sense of a transition period between pre-Celtic pagan times and early Christian times in Ireland. So you can imagine that some of these stones would have been carved and inscribed around the time perhaps that St. Patrick came to Ireland. Some of them date to the 5th century. Others on linguistic grounds we can place at the 6th and the 7th century. And a number of Irish language scholars such as David McManus in Trinity College, Finbar Moore from an archaeological perspective in the National Monument Service, they've studied the Ogham stones in more recent times. So it has been possible for us to provide more accurate dating information based on the landscape setting and on the linguistic context as well. There's also a possibility that some of them may be associated with hermits, with pilgrimage routes. In Kerry and Cork, some of them are sited still in very beautiful, remote locations. Others have been found, like for instance at Ahadoe in Kerry near Killarney in Kerry, the church site. There was an old inscription found there, and several other church sites as well, Kilbannan, Aglish on the Dingle Peninsula. There's a particular concentration of them in the southwest, Cork, Kerry and County Waterford as well. There's really a lot for the visitor to the museum to reflect upon when they look at the stone carvings with their inscriptions. I mean, they link back to the landscape that they came from originally and the manner in which they tie in with with the particular context, either with church sites or with underground passages, souterrains within ring forts, or in some cases they're simply dug up or discovered, during agricultural work, during digging. And also then there's the fact that even though we don't know who they are representative of, I suppose you could say, shadowy, distant people that we know nothing else about except for the fact that they, particular individuals, and their line, which is specified, so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, or the grandson of somebody, that they were sufficiently important that somebody carved a stone and maybe placed it on a boundary in some cases, perhaps as a way to establish ownership of land in the vicinity of where the Ogham stones were found, or that they were placed within a location that was important to those particular people, whether within a church, or a few of them were built into souterrains within ring forts. In most instances, the Ogham stones are actually built into walls or parts of windowsills, or it might be fairly casually built into church. So it's difficult to tell whether it's unlikely that the church was actually built around an Ogham stone. but we have to remember that the church sites that we see today that might substantially date to, say, the 14th or 15th century, many of those sites were established on much earlier foundations. So the Ogham stones that are found within church sites may not be in their primary location. They may have been moved around, and what we look at now when we look across a wall into a churchyard may be much, much later than the original foundation, which in some cases may go right back to pre-Christian times. This is one of the Sheela-na-gigs from the collections of the National Museum of Ireland. A Sheela-na-gig is essentially an exhibitionist figure. As you can see here, we have a woman down on her hunkers, a female figure, exposing the genitalia. This one is perhaps a little more subtle than some of the more obvious carvings of Sheela-na-gigs in the collections. But this one is from a place called Sir Kieran in County Offaly, and that's a monastic site, one of the major monastic centres in the Midlands. Probably the most frequent interpretation is that they have some connection with fertility and fertility rite, and perhaps as a means to encourage higher levels of fertility. We have also had interest in our collections in the National Museum from people interested in even midwifery, that they might be seen in some way as images of reproduction and different means of positions for giving birth. There's also been suggestion, even from quite recent folk tradition, that they may have been representations to ward off evil spirits or even simply to frighten away the enemy. We have instances recorded of kind of exhibitionist behaviour on the part of women in frightening off people who are maybe attacking land or looking to take possessions, even within the last 100 or 150 years. So there are several different interpretations that are worth looking at. And again, as with many of the other objects on loan to Trove, it's very much part, we think, of the visitor's experience to the museum and to the exhibition to consider the range of possibilities. And nothing is entirely clear-cut or even, dare I say, cast in stone. It is very much open to the viewer to either to perhaps think that it's most likely to be connected with fertility or maybe any number of other reasons.